Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Heather Cox Richardson's book, Democracy Awakening: Notes on the State of America. So if you don't know Heather Cox Richardson, you absolutely should. She's the author of Letters from an American, which is a daily newsletter. She does really, really amazing political commentary, analysis of what's currently going on from the perspective of a historian of U.S. history, someone who is very, very familiar with the uneven contours of American progress, American political development, etc., etc. Now, if you have been a longtime reader of Letters from an American, you will recognize big chunks of Democracy Awakening already. I had been reading Richardson's newsletter for at least a year, if not more, before Democracy Awakening actually came out. Yeah, I mean, it very much, she translates a lot of the material from the newsletter into the book. But what the book does that enhances what the newsletter does is the book gives this a sort of overarching systemic approach to looking at U.S. history, and particularly to looking at this specific moment in U.S. history. I mean, this was published in 2023. So at that point, obviously, we didn't know there was going to be a second Trump administration. But I mean, the fact that it was a possibility and that the MAGA movement still existed, etc., etc. I'll start you off with the opening couple of paragraphs of her foreword here. America is at a crossroads. A country that once stood as the global symbol of democracy has been teetering on the brink of authoritarianism. How did this happen? Is the fall of democracy in the United States inevitable? And if not, how can we reclaim our democratic principles? That's essentially the statement of purpose for this book. That's what Richardson is really interested in, is how did we get to a point where we can now have President Musk, if we're being honest, basically dismantling the U.S. government, and a Republican-dominated Congress is doing nothing to protect the constitutional order of our republic. Well, what Richardson essentially argues, if you're going to boil this book down to one key point, is that U.S. history has always been a pendulum, swinging between a more authoritarian worldview in which some people, i.e. white wealthy men, believe that they are the only ones who should have a say in how society is run and that they should have control over everyone else who will obey them, and then swings to the other side. I think on the screen that looked like a swing from right to left, but for me, that was from left to right, which is actually backwards, right? Because the right wing side is the more authoritarian hierarchical side, whereas the left, which I think from your perspective, this is now looking right, but this should visually be left for you. The left is the much more egalitarian approach, the version of America that attempts to live up to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all people are created equal and that they are endowed with certain rights, the ideas of the Enlightenment, right? That the things that the framers of the Constitution very much believed, that consent of that a government is built on the consent of the governed, that a population must have access to trustworthy information in order to govern itself responsibly, etc., etc. And so what she essentially talks about in this book is these swings back and forth between this much more restrictive system in which particular people believe that they should be able to control everyone else, versus these much more liberatory moments in which things get better for the vast majority of the population. And one of the things that's really striking about this is that she makes this distinction between, because it isn't for her a question of liberalism versus conservatism. It's a question of how political terms get distinctly redefined in the US in ways that end up constructing our ideologies. So, for instance, one of the things that she very much is interested in is the idea of conservatives or conservatism. In the US, conservatism right now tends to be very close to authoritarianism, if not outright fascism. Authoritarianism involves a very strong government that is empowered to impose values on the populace, that is empowered to utilize military force, police force, judicial force, without being restricted by the rule of law. It is a system in which the ends justify the means, and the ends are to empower those that the system, the authoritarian system, believes should be empowered. But that's not what proper conservatism is. The intellectual history of conservatism, as she points out, begins with a guy named Edmund Burke, who was an English statesman during the period of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the age of revolutions. And what she says here is, the idea of a conservative stance in politics emerged during the French Revolution when Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke recoiled from what was happening on the other side of the English Channel. As revolutionaries in France abolished the traditional hierarchies of government and the church, Burke took a stand against radical change driven by people trying to make the government enforce a specific ideology. Ideologically driven government was radical and dangerous, he thought, because the ideology quickly became more important than the reality of the way society and people actually worked. In 1790, Burke argued that the role of government was not to impose a worldview, but rather to promote stability, and that lawmakers could achieve that stability most effectively by supporting traditional structures, social hierarchies, the church, property, the family. Conservative meant literally conserving what was already there without reference to an ideology. Those in charge of government should make changes slowly according to facts on the ground in order to keep the country stable. This idea also meant that government could be a positive force in society rather than a negative one. Now, that I actually don't have a massive problem with. I'm not a conservative. I don't in any sense identify as a conservative. But there's a good logic to Burkean conservatism. The idea that we figure out what works best within a society and we preserve those structures. Now, one of the problems that I have with this is the question, for whom does this work best, right? If the institution of slavery exists within a society and that is deemed to work best, it works best from the perspective of those who own slaves rather than from the perspective of the slaves. And so this becomes one of the big problems with Burkean conservatism. But again, it has a core goal of maintaining stability within society so that things basically function. Contemporary U.S. conservatism is a very different beast. It is what's called movement conservatism. And basically, if if you have read the newsletters, you will have heard this term before. But basically, movement conservatism emerged in response to the New Deal and the beginnings of the frankly rather pathetic welfare state that developed in the United States in order to protect the vast majority of people from the ravages of capitalism. But what she says here is, on the other hand, were the few people, William F. Buckley, she just says Buckley, and Bozell, I didn't look up Brent Bozell Jr. Sorry. So, on the other hand, were the few people Buckley and Bozell called conservatives in an echo of the 1937 Conservative Manifesto. They wanted America to return to the world of the 1920s to protect the ability of businessmen to run the economy as they saw fit. According to Buckley's argument, businessmen could gain the support of religious traditionalists who were less interested in deregulating business than they were in overturning the trend toward liberal values. Traditionalists thought that liberalism in government undermined religion by weakening traditional family structures and social hierarchies that put men in charge of their families the same way that God oversaw the world. Thus, they believed the liberal consensus served evil. The liberal consensus, by the way, is what developed between the sort of early portion of the New Deal up through the 1970s, where basically everybody on both sides of the political aisle believed that the government should play a role in protecting the most vulnerable within society, regulating business to prevent its most destructive aims, ensuring that communal goals were met, etc., etc. Thus, they believed the liberal consensus served evil. Government must stand firm behind what they called free enterprise and religion. Those values were not negotiable. Buckley and Bozell acknowledged that they were trying to overturn the shared belief system that had stabilized the country and that they were doing so on the basis of ideology. This was the opposite of true conservatism, which Edmund Burke had conceived to stand against ideologically based government, and readers at the time noted that the plan was, in fact, radical. It was a political movement, one that would come to be known as movement conservatism. And that's what the Reagan Revolution was the imposition of movement conservatism on a country that, by and large, actually liked the liberal consensus. And a lot of that was done in these very problematic and tricky ways, because the Republican Party, starting from the era of Nixon, aligned things like business regulation with civil rights. And so the racist vote of what had been a solidly Democratic South under the Dixiecrats, that was a big part of the swing from a solidly Democratic South to a solidly Republican South among white voters, it's worth noting. You also had the Republican Party and these far-right movement conservatives align their desire for deregulation with opposition to women's rights and the demonization of feminism, and the increasing focus of an evangelical movement on anti-abortion activism. And so all of those things meshed together, often in support of politicians who didn't really necessarily care about achieving the specific social aims that their constituents wanted, right? So, but more importantly than that is the point that what movement conservatism did and what the contemporary Republican Party is doing is not the imposition or the creation of programs that are designed to work. It is the imposition or the creation of programs that are ideologically driven. They believe, for instance, or they claim to believe, that the government is full of waste, fraud and corruption, and so they are actively destroying large swaths of the government. The problem is that has massively detrimental consequences for U.S. society. It is actively damaging to this country, and to the people of this country more significantly. And so it is, in this sense, one of the least conservative things one could possibly do. Instead, it is an authoritarian move. And Richardson talks about authoritarianism as well. So one of the things that she says here, in regards to scholars of authoritarianism and how they explain things, is the key to the rise of authoritarians, they explain, is their use of language and false history. Authoritarians rise when economic, social, political, or religious change make members of a formerly powerful group feel as if they have been left behind. Their frustration makes them vulnerable to leaders who promise to make them dominant again. A strongman downplays the real conditions that have created their problems and tells them that the only reason they have been dispossessed is that enemies have cheated them of power. Such leaders undermine existing power structures, and as they collapse, people previously apathetic about politics turn into activists, not necessarily expecting a better life, but seeing themselves as heroes reclaiming the country. Leaders don't try to persuade people to support real solutions, but instead reinforce their followers' fantasy self-image and organize them into a mass movement. Once people internalize their leaders' propaganda, it doesn't matter when pieces of it are proven to be lies because it has become central to their identity. As a strongman becomes more and more destructive, followers' loyalty only increases. Having begun to treat their perceived enemies badly, they need to believe their victims deserve it. Turning against the leader who inspired such behavior would mean admitting they had been wrong and that they, not their enemies, are evil. This they cannot do. And this is, of course, a very, very basic point that pretty much all scholars of authoritarianism recognize: the use of misinformation, the use of mythologized history, and the use of ideology to support this sort of narrative of resistance is very, very central to authoritarianism. And one of the things that Richardson tries to do in this book is to challenge any simplistic conception of American history by, again, showing us these conflicts, these swings back and forth between periods like, say, the 1850s or the 1920s, in which there was a small group of people who had tremendous power and influence and wealth, and they set the agenda for their benefit at the expense of the vast majority of people. But then you get these reactions to those moments. The abolition of slavery, for instance, and the incomplete and not entirely effective destruction of the antebellum planter class in the 1860s into the early 70s, the establishment of the New Deal in the 30s, and then the expansion of social programs, the social safety net, communal resources like the interstate highway system, etc., the Environmental Protection Agency into the 1970s. You have these swings back and forth. And one of the things that Richardson is very clear about is that U.S. history is never done, necessarily. Like, we never reach a point where it's like, all right, we've gotten to the true America. We are constantly in these backwards and forward swings. And as depressing as everything is right now politically, and as much as the Trump administration or the Musk administration is trying to damage this country and the world, I do think we're going to see a swing back, and I think we're going to end up better than we were prior to the Trump administration. I think we're going to I don't know. Maybe this is overly optimistic, but I really do think that, like, the fact that Luigi Mangione memes are filling the internet and that people are en masse angry about the role that billionaires play in setting our government policy, the fact that that government switchboards have been overwhelmed with calls of people protesting what's going on. I think we as a culture, we as a people, are not interested in authoritarianism. And I hope that that collective desire not to have an authoritarian government, but to have a democratic government that better lives up to the ideals of the United States, the ideals of equality and fairness and the consent of the governed. I hope that that can be achieved with an absolute minimum of violence. But I'm not as confident about that. I think we will come out better on some level than we were before. I think we may get things like much better protections for LGBT people. We may get a much more secure right to reproductive care. We might, I think, very likely get some version of universal health care because of this, because of all of the things that are being weaponized against the vast majority of the population in this country. I think we as a people are moving beyond a point where we're interested in tolerating it. And I think the Trump-Musk administration is making increasingly clear who is hurting us and why. Again, I hope we can move past it without the hundreds of thousands who died in the Civil War to free the slaves, without the millions who suffered during the Great Depression, etc., etc. But we'll see.